What's going on? Theo Gremminger for Fantasy Points. We're talking about Dynasty offseason winners, players who benefited from the moves that their team made in free agency, or some of the players that were lost around them. Different ways to gain Dynasty value, but all of these players are in better situations than when the offseason started. We're talking about players who may have a path to more touches, may have a pathway to being more heavily utilized by their teams, and could score a lot more fantasy points this season.
What?
Why are you shaking your head?
You're welcome.
Got to start out at the top, and we got to talk about Jayden Daniels. Jayden Daniels was sensational as a rookie. This was a player that had the second most fantasy points all time at the quarterback position for a rookie. Only Cam Newton scored more fantasy points his rookie season than Jayden Daniels. And then we look at what the Commanders have already done, and we're 37 days out from the NFL draft. The Commanders still have that late first-round pick, and they could very well go with a running back, another wide receiver, another offensive lineman. That could be an offensive pick. But if that pick goes to a defensive player, at this point, we can still say Jayden Daniels is an offseason winner. The Commanders went out and traded for Laramie Tunsil from the Houston Texans. Go out and get a franchise tackle and a young enough tackle that this can be a long-term player next to Jayden Daniels. So they addressed their offensive tackle need in a major way with the trade for Laramie Tunsil. Now, there were some locker room issues, apparently, with Tunsil in Houston, but now he's got a fresh start with a winning team that made it all the way to the NFC Championship game. And, of course, he's going to be blocking for one of the best quarterbacks in football in Jayden Daniels. What else did Washington do? They re-signed Zach Ertz, and this is a low-key move for them. But Zach Ertz was a very, very good weapon for Daniels last year, sort of his easy-button target. When Terry McLaurin was not open downfield, Zach Ertz was his preferred weapon underneath. We saw Zach Ertz have several games where he really helped Daniels. I don't think that this was necessarily the path. Last year, they drafted Ben Sinnott in the second round. Ertz seemed like a placeholder tight end, but Washington wisely brought back Zach Ertz. So if Ben Sinnott takes over, it means that he outplayed a guy who finished as a tight end 1 last year. And if Ben Sinnott takes a step forward, it opens up Washington to run more 12 personnel. So any way you cut it, the Ertz signing was a good one. And on top of that, Washington went out and traded for Deebo Samuel. Now, Deebo Samuel regressed a bit last year, to say the least, in San Francisco. This was his worst season offensively in quite some time. But he did have some early season production where he was scoring at a very high rate, then got sick, had pneumonia during the year. It was just a weird year for Deebo. But when you look at Washington, Washington lacked wide receivers with yak ability. Deebo can still do that. Deebo with the ball in his hands is still a player that can challenge NFL defenses. Washington also had a lack of a wide receiver too. They lost Diami Brown to Jacksonville. Olamide Zacchaeus, Noah Brown, guys like that were filling in at the wide receiver 2 spot. So they add Deebo Samuel in that role opposite Terry McLaurin. Jayden Daniels now has better weapons, a better offensive line, and is really looking at a potential MVP season if the things bounce Washington's way. Let's stay at the quarterback position. Let's talk about Justin Fields. Justin Fields went from a guy on your bench in Dynasty to being in your starting lineup. And if you're a super flex manager in Dynasty with Justin Fields, wheels up. You now have a considerable edge at the quarterback position. Is Justin Fields the kind of player that NFL teams are going to bank on long-term? No. The Jets gave him a 2-year deal worth $40 million. This is a team-friendly deal. He's being viewed as a bridge quarterback, not a long-term answer for the Jets. But for us, he's in our fantasy lineups any week that he's starting. Justin Fields has been electric in terms of a fantasy football asset. He's 23rd all-time in rushing yards at the quarterback position, over 2,500 rushing yards as a pro. And on top of that, out of his last 24 starts, This stat blew my mind. Out of Justin Fields' last 24 starts, 11 of them were top 5 finishes at the quarterback position. So this is a player that has a chance to be a top 10 quarterback in fantasy. Justin Fields goes from being on a bench to being in your starting lineup and a chance to rejuvenate his career in New York. He could have a pathway like Sam Darnold, where Sam Darnold ends up going to a situation where he takes over. Of course, that was an injury situation. J.J. McCarthy could have challenged last year. But when it comes down to it, Justin Fields could be on that similar pathway like a Sam Darnold and regain dynasty value. Baker Mayfield in Tampa Bay regain dynasty value very quickly. You land in a situation with a team who gives you an opportunity. You put up fantasy points for us, and fantasy managers have a very short memory. Justin Fields can go back up to QB1 land in dynasty if he brings the heat this year on the field, and he certainly has the opportunity. Let's talk about another offseason winner. Let's talk about his teammate. Let's talk about Garrett Wilson. Now, Garrett Wilson's been a player that he's 24 years old, and Garrett Wilson has been an elite target earner his entire NFL career. 147 targets as a rookie, 168 targets in year 2, 153 targets this past season. Now, this past year, he crossed over the 100-catch barrier, had 101 receptions, had 1,100 receiving yards, finished the year as the wide receiver 18, but still was in this place where he was sort of in limbo, like a purgatory player, where the Jets had Davante Adams. We didn't know which way they were going to go. Instead, Davante Adams is now an LA Ram, and Garrett Wilson is the clear-cut wide receiver 1 in this offense. And when we look at Garrett Wilson, the metrics over at Fantasy Points Data, outstanding. This is a player that even with Davante Adams, he still had a 25.2% target share. But Davante Adams had a 27% target share. Now Garrett Wilson is the clear-cut wide receiver 1 in this offense, and the usage should be absolutely elite. When you look at Garrett Wilson, his percentage of team air yards, he had a 35.3% air yard share. When you look at Garrett Wilson as a first read target, he was up there. Garrett Wilson was one of the more heavily targeted players in the league despite Davante Adams. Now he has a pathway to do what DJ Moore did alongside Justin Fields a few years back. Justin Fields is never going to be a guy who challenges for the passing records in the league for the year. You're not going to see Justin Fields end of the year up there in terms of passing touchdowns, in terms of passing yardage. But Justin Fields showed that he can elevate his number 1 target. We saw DJ Moore have a wide receiver 6 overall season in 2023. Garrett Wilson could be on that track. Wilson is firmly back in the wide receiver 1 role in New York. He's firmly back in the offensive playmaker role in New York. And on top of that, he has a familiarity with Justin Fields. Justin Fields played 2 seasons alongside Garrett Wilson at Ohio State. So if you believe in the locker room narrative is going to be strong here. Garrett Wilson has continually praised Justin Fields throughout his career, has said that he'd like to play with him at some point. So everything just went well for Garrett Wilson this past offseason. And Garrett Wilson's not the only wide receiver to benefit from the offseason. We're talking about the 2 wide receivers in San Francisco, Ricky Pearsall and Jawan Jennings. Now, Pearsall and Jennings, they're obviously different tracks here. Pearsall was a first-round pick last year, and Jawan Jennings was a player who had his breakout season as a pro this past year. So Jennings had really an outstanding season in terms of all of the metrics. Jennings outscored Deebo Samuel. Brandon Ayuk went down with an injury. Jawan Jennings completely stepped up. Jawan Jennings last year had a 22.7% target share, which led San Francisco. He now has a pathway to push that target share up to the 25% range. Deebo Samuel is gone. Brandon Ayuk looks like he's headed out the door, and he's going to be banged up to start the season at a minimum. Jawan Jennings should return to a prominent featured role. We saw Brock Purdy looking his way over and over again last year. we saw some immense spike weeks when it came to Jawan Jennings. So Jawan Jennings gets to feature in probably in a similar role to last year. And Jawan Jennings was a 29.3% target as a first read rate guy, meaning Brock Purdy looked his way more so on the first read than anyone on the team, including George Kittle, who was a 21.5% first read guy. So we put Jawan Jennings at one wide receiver spot. And then we've got to talk about Ricky Pearsall. And Ricky Pearsall is a player that last year we were getting excited about. And of course, Ricky Pearsall, the narrative was always 2025 for him because Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, when he was drafted, were both in this sort of purgatory where one of them might get moved. Of course, they end up moving Deebo Samuel to Washington, but it looks like Ayuk might be gone too. So the Ricky Pearsall narrative is there. Now, when you talk about Pearsall, you're talking about an elite athletic wide receiver. His measurables at the NFL Combine were through the roof. He gets pushed into the first round of the NFL Draft. One of the main reasons was the athletic testing numbers. So when it comes to Pearsall, we also saw him end the season on a very high note. He had back-to-back weeks where he was scoring 18 or more PPR points in week 17 and weeks 18. That could continue this season. And do not underestimate Ricky Pearsall taking on some of the manufactured touches for Deebo Samuel. Now, Deebo Samuel led the league in rush attempts at the wide receiver spot. Do I think Ricky Pearsall is going to have a Deebo Samuel-like rush share and rush attempts? No. But I think you can emulate that by getting the ball in Ricky Pearsall's hands around the line of scrimmage, using him on screens, using him on smoke, and using him on all sorts of gadget-type plays to get the ball in his hands. Certainly wide receiver sweeps. Ricky Pearsall is a plus-level athlete. A lot of people are pointing out guys like Rome Odunze, Marvin Harrison Jr. to take a huge step forward in year two. Ricky Pearsall could also emulate that model and be a huge breakout player. So Jawan Jennings and Ricky Pearsall, both big offseason winners. Let's look at a running back. Let's talk about Najee Harris. Najee Harris landed absolutely perfectly. If we were a month back and we were sitting here in February, sitting here in January, and talking about the landing spots that we wanted guys like Omarion Hampton, guys like Ashton Genty, guys like Travion Henderson to land in, everybody circled the Los Angeles Chargers because the Los Angeles Chargers have Greg Roman and Jim Harbaugh and an offense that wants to run the football. LA passed on running back last draft class, and that was probably the correct move based on the performance of some of these rookie running backs out of the 2024 class. And it was widely assumed LA was going to find their long-term answer at running back in the 2025 NFL draft class. It's a great class of running backs. Now, LA could still draft a running back, but it's not going to be in the first round. That ship has sailed because they signed Najee Harris. He's getting over $9 million this year to be the running back in LA. This is a player that Jim Harbaugh tried to recruit to Michigan. He ends up going to Alabama, ends up being a first-round selection of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and has had a very strong career. He's sort of fallen out of favor with fantasy managers, but Najee Harris has a lot of things that check off boxes that NFL coaches are going to love, including Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman. Najee Harris has had over 1,000 rushing yards every season of his career. He plays every single game, and he plays injured. Najee Harris is a guy that always gets banged up and always plays through it. He's got toughness, and NFL coaches, a lot of them are old school guys, and they absolutely value that. Harbaugh and Roman, two guys synonymous with running back attempts, running back production. When you look at what LA did last year with guys like J.K. Dobbins, some Gus Edwards, they were top 12 in the NFL in rush attempts. Now they add Najee Harris. You can go ahead and put another check next to Najee Harris getting 1,000 yards this year. And one underrated aspect of Najee Harris is LA's not going to hyper target the running back out of the backfield. This is not a team that's going to use Najee Harris in some role like we saw him used as a rookie, where Ben Roethlisberger continually targeted him out of the backfield as sort of a check down guy. But Najee Harris has failed to hit 50 receptions or more for 3 straight years now, after having over 70 as a rookie. I think it's an open job where he could end up with 50 receptions this year. Nothing insane, but he could be top 10 in running back receptions this year. He had 36 receptions last year. This year, he could push that to the 50 to 55 role if he sees a large enough snap share in this offense. So Najee Harris goes from sort of RB3 purgatory to a potential top 20 season. And if he falls in the end zone enough, this could be a player that gives you top 15 value at the running back spot. He goes to a better offense with a long-term answer at quarterback in Justin Herbert, leaves Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh seems to be going in different directions, does not have clarity at the quarterback spot. LA made the playoffs last year. Of course, Pittsburgh did as well. But Pittsburgh looks like a team that's going to struggle to make the playoffs this year. And if they do, probably lose in the first round would be where most people would project them. LA, year 2 with Jim Harbaugh, Greg Roman, if they have a strong NFL draft, you could see LA being a team that people are picking as an AFC West championship contender. This is a really, really good landing spot for Harris, and his dynasty value has been rejuvenated by it. And one player we've got to talk about to round out our winners, we got to talk about Chase Brown, because the storyline right now in Cincinnati is the Bengals have used over 50% of their cap space on Joe Burrow, T. Higgins, and Jamar Chase. The show goes on in Cincy. Joe Burrow, could have been named an offseason winner here because T. Higgins and Jamar Chase are now locked down. To the best wide receiver duo in the league, last year's wide receiver 1 overall, and probably the best wide receiver 2 in football right now in T. Higgins. Those two are attached to Joe Burrow, no questions asked. What does that do to the rest of the roster? To me, this makes Chase Brown's job a lot safer. Now, Cincinnati could have gone out and signed a running back that was a potential threat to Chase Brown's touches. Instead, they went out and got Samaje Perine, a former Bengal, to return to Cincinnati. Samaje Perine at 29 years old is zero threat to Chase Brown in terms of taking his job. So Chase Brown's going to have to survive the NFL draft. There's going to be a lot of threats, even on day 3, to cut into his touch share. But when we look at Chase Brown, the scoring last year was phenomenal. It was his second year in the league, and he ends up just completely breaking out. Averaged 15.9 points per game. He had almost 1,000 rushing yards, but on top of that, he had 54 receptions, and he had 11 total touchdowns. And that 15.9 points per game, that also factors in how slow he was out the gate. Chase Brown had 10 or fewer points in his first 3 games of the season, and then completely exploded. He had that stretch of games between week 9 and week 15 where he scored at least 19 points every single week. So you had 6 straight weeks with 19 points or more. Chase Brown has showed you that he can be a very close to it high-end RB1, and now he's going to be the focal point running back in one of the best offenses in football. Everybody's going to be back, and Cincinnati is going to be way more likely to draft defensive linemen, to draft other defensive players, and address their offensive line with another offensive line pickup in this NFL draft. They are not going to go out and get a threat to Chase Brown on day 1 or day 2 of the draft. Now, day 3, they could add somebody, but even if they do, Chase Brown is going to enter this season as a probable RB1 in redraft. This Bengals offense might lead the NFL in scoring, and Chase Brown will continue to be a big reason why. I'm Theo Gremminger. If you like videos like this, make sure you're subscribed to Fantasy Points. We've got you covered with everything you need to know to crush your fantasy league this season. Dynasty, redraft, best ball, NFL draft coverage. We've got it all. We're going to see you soon, and let's crush it this season together.